Great, thanks, Josh. I appreciate that. Thanks for coming today. I appreciate it. I have some riveting topics to talk about. I know you guys, I see a lot of similar faces that have come to other Carnegie College events. Today we're going to talk about some fun stuff. So as a headline, we're going to talk about required minimum distributions. We're going to talk a little bit about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and then we're going to talk a little bit about gifting. And throughout the hard facts that I go through, if you have any questions, please interrupt me, raise your hand, and I'll do my best to answer your question. If I can't, maybe we can answer your question during a meeting that we set up with me, Josh, or your portfolio manager and advisor. So starting with the required minimum distributions, some of the basic rules around this minimum distribution that you need to withdraw from your retirement accounts. It must be withdrawn from all IRAs and retirement plans separately the year you reach 70 and a half. So depending on when your birthday is, that will determine the year in which you turn 70 and a half. And there's a calculation to determining that minimum distribution. It's pretty straightforward. You take the balance of the account on December 31st of the prior year, and you divide that by the appropriate life expectancy factor. It's a life expectancy factor that the IRS determines, and basically how long you're going to live. And there's various tables that you can use for those life expectancy factors. And those are, I believe it's publication 590 on the IRS's website. Don't worry about that. If you're a client of Carnegie's, we will help calculate those required minimum distributions for you, and we will help you satisfy those minimum distributions. Generally, the deadline for satisfying your required minimum distributions is December 31st, with one caveat. And that caveat is your very first required minimum distribution can actually be delayed until April 1st of the following year. But generally speaking, if you remember anything about required minimum distributions today, I think it should be that you need to satisfy that minimum distribution, pull the money out of your retirement accounts by December 31st.
Bryan, why would someone delay that first year? What would be some scenarios that somebody might want to delay that very first distribution?
That's a great question. I think it depends on your overall tax situation, specifically your income situation. So when you pull money out of your IRAs, for example, that's considered income, and in most cases you have to pay income tax on that. Well, if I turn 70 and a half in 2018, for example, I have a choice. I can satisfy my very first minimum distribution in 2018, or I can delay it and push it out until early 2019. And I may want to do that if I have a lot of income, and I'm in a higher tax bracket right now in 2018. So maybe an example is I retired from my job when I was 66, and I have a 4-year deferred income payout from the small business that I was running. So I have income for a 4-year period of time, let's say $80,000. So in that 4th year, the year in which I turned 70 and a half, I have $80,000 of income coming in. I know that the following year, in 2019, I won't have that income anymore, and therefore it might make sense in that scenario where you have more income in 2018 to push out your very first minimum distribution until 2019. With income tax brackets, they're progressive. So every additional dollar of income that you receive, it's taxed at your highest marginal tax rate. So if I know my minimum distribution is $20,000, if I take that in 2018, that $20,000 is going to be taxed at the highest marginal tax rate for me. In 2019, I don't have that $80,000 of income from selling my business, and I might be in a lower tax bracket. I may want to satisfy my first minimum distribution of $20,000 in 2019. Question, go ahead.
Over 70 and a half, you're working and you're putting money in an IRA. You have to take money out of that IRA.
Yes. If the question is, let me repeat the question. The question is, if you're still working, you're 70, at least 70 and a half, and you have an IRA, do you need to satisfy a minimum distribution?
Question
Sorry.
is, you're putting money in a retirement account at your work,
Great.
okay? And you're still putting it in. You have to take money out of that retirement account.
Okay, so it depends on the type of retirement account. If you're still working and say you have a 401k, then you don't, if you're still working and you have a 401k, you don't have to satisfy a minimum distribution on that 401k. But if you have an IRA and you're still working, you do have to satisfy that minimum distribution. So you have to make a distinction on the type of retirement account. If it's a 401k, a 403b, you don't have to satisfy. An IRA, you do. Great question.
Bryan, you have a question down there?
Sure.
What if you take that deferral, will you have two to claim that year? Yes.
Great question. So in that example where in 2018 it was the final year of my $80,000 payout from my business, I decided to delay my very first minimum distribution. The question is, do you have to satisfy two required minimum distributions in 2019? And the answer is yes. Because I've delayed my very first required minimum distribution into 2019, I will then have two required minimum distributions in 2019 that I have to satisfy. So in the example, it was $20,000 in 2018 and roughly $20,000 in 2019. So that's $40,000 that I need to take out of my IRA in 2019. But again, the deadline December 31st for all subsequent required minimum distributions. Question?
Are there any restrictions on how I use that money I've taken out?
Great
Can I
question.
put it right back in?
Great question. So the question is, are there any restrictions on how you use the money that you're required to take out of your retirement account? The answer is no. There are no restrictions on how you use that money coming out of your retirement account. You could spend the money. You could reinvest the money in a non-retirement account. So let me take a step back. I guess there is a restriction. And the one restriction is you can't take it out and then put it back into the IRA. You can take it out of your IRA and reinvest it maybe in your trust account or your joint account that you have with your spouse, maybe a taxable brokerage account. It could be reinvested in. Does that answer your question?
Bryan, you have one more question down here to your left.
Go ahead.
I think I know the answer, but using the same scenario, if someone's not yet 70 and a half, but they take some money out, not a required money, but they take the money out, then they turn 70 and a half, say the next year, they still then have to meet that RMD at that time, right?
Correct. So the question is, if you take money out of your retirement account before 70 and a half, do you still have to satisfy a minimum distribution when you turn 70 and a half and every year subsequently? The answer is yes. Just to add some color to that, you can always take money out of your retirement account. The question I ask myself is do you have to pay income taxes on it? And is there a penalty subject to that withdrawal? We go right into the penalty. So, if you don't fully satisfy that minimum distribution, the IRS will penalize you 50% of the amount that you don't pull out. So let me use an example. Let's say your required minimum distribution, again, is $20,000 from your IRA. and you only take out $12,000 from your IRA. You don't fully satisfy that minimum distribution. There's $8,000 that was not removed from your IRA by the deadline. You're penalized on 50% of that $8,000. So a $4,000 penalty in that example. It's a big penalty. That's why it's so important that we're addressing this topic and making sure that we all understand the rules around minimum distributions. Go ahead, question.
You just have to have the entire amount out by December 31st, or do you have to stagger during the year?
Great question. The question is, do you have to have all of it out by December 31st, or can you stagger it throughout the year? It's the latter. You can certainly stagger it throughout the year. There's no rules around when you satisfy that minimum distribution, as long as you take out at least the minimum by December 31st. So we have clients at Carnegie that live off of their minimum distribution. They spend that money, and they prefer to have that minimum distribution come to them on a monthly basis. So we determine what the minimum distribution is in, for example, January of 2019. We figure out that dollar amount, divide it by 12, and we send money to our clients 1/12 of that minimum distribution every single month. So from a timing standpoint, you could do it as a lump sum, you could set it up periodically, whatever your preference is.
If you take it out as lump sum at the end, how do you pay estimated tax?
So when you withdraw money from your IRA, whether it's a required minimum distribution or not, you have the option to withhold a percentage of that amount for income taxes, federal income tax and state income tax. And I highly recommend that you consider withholding a percentage of that minimum distribution for taxes. And I apologize, I didn't repeat the question. The question was, when you pull money out of the IRA, how do you plan for taxes, in essence, I believe. And again, you can withhold a portion of that distribution for taxes. So I think it's important that you work with maybe your tax advisor or your financial advisor to determine a good amount to withhold for federal income tax and a good amount to withhold for state income tax. Go ahead.
Take it as a lump sum, take it out on December 31st, and you pay your appropriate tax, you're going to be penalized because you
could.
Didn't pay your taxes quarterly and paid it all at the end of the year.
Yeah, so the question is, if you took it out as a lump sum on December 31st, is there an issue with not paying your income taxes in a timely fashion with the IRS? And not being a CPA, not being a tax advisor, I'm not entirely sure about that, but my guess is
I'll jump in there for you, Brian. So actually, the IRS considers a tax withholding from an IRA to satisfy any quarterly payments that you need to make. So I've actually had clients over the years that use the strategy that they wait until December, take their required minimum distribution. As long as 1% of it goes to you, the other 99% can be spread between the federal government and the state. So you can actually do a 99% distribution to go to taxes, and that satisfies their quarterly estimates. So you actually don't run into that problem, and it's a nice strategy to be able to keep more of your money, right, throughout the year, because it does satisfy that requirement.
Just to add to that, you'll get a tax form the following year called a 1099-R that shows the gross amount that you withdrew from your IRA, for example, and then the amount withheld for taxes. Because the custodian, for example, a Charles Schwab or a Fidelity, will send that withholding to the IRS on your behalf. And it's the custodian's responsibility to send that tax form to the IRS as well as you. You'll receive that tax form as well.
So, Brian, before we move on, I'm going to ask one more question that people might have. I know nobody in this room has IRAs with other investment advisors, but if you happen to have an IRA account with another brokerage firm or investment advisor, and I have two IRAs, right? One that's held at Schwab and one that's held at Fidelity. Do I have to take a distribution out of each account, or can I satisfy it by taking out of just one? As it relates to IRAs, you can satisfy your
total required minimum distribution from multiple IRAs, all from one IRA. You can do that. You have that flexibility. With that said, if you have IRAs with multiple institutions, you can see how this might be challenging in calculating the minimum distribution and making sure that you're fully satisfying the minimum distribution from all your retirement accounts. So I would recommend that you consider consolidating your IRAs with one institution, hopefully with us here at Carnegie.
There's another question.
Go ahead.
The Roth is separate.
Great question.
You do not have to take distribution on the Roth?
The question is, are there required minimum distributions for Roth IRAs? The answer is no. Roth IRAs do not have required minimum distributions. I'm going to move into the second slide because I think we referenced that here. There are some exceptions to satisfying required minimum distributions from 401ks and 403bs or small business accounts if you're still working. I believe a gentleman over here had asked this. If you're still working, do you have to satisfy that minimum distribution on a 401k or a small business account? The answer is no. That's an exception. Again, Roth IRAs do not have required minimum distributions. What about inherited retirement accounts? For example, inherited Roth IRAs. Any type of inherited retirement account does have a required minimum distribution. If my father has an IRA and he passes away and I'm the beneficiary of that IRA, and I decide to open an inherited IRA because I was listed as the beneficiary, I am required to satisfy a minimum distribution from that inherited retirement account. Even if it's an inherited traditional IRA or even an inherited Roth IRA, again, those inherited retirement accounts do have minimum distributions that need to be satisfied. The very first one needs to be satisfied the year following the original account holder's date of death. So if my dad passed away in 2018 and I inherited his IRA, I have to satisfy my very first distribution from that inherited IRA in 2019.
Based on whose?
Life expectancy. The question is that minimum distribution, how is it calculated? It's calculated based on my life expectancy going forward. So therefore, the actual calculation would be the value of the account on December 31st of the prior year divided by my life expectancy. And how that is calculated going forward on inherited IRAs is slightly different than how it's calculated on if you had your own IRA. But generally speaking, that minimum distribution for me in this example will be much lower because my life expectancy is greater, and when you have a larger number as far as in the denominator of that calculation, it'll make it be a smaller amount that I need to take out, which is a wonderful strategy. And I'm going a little beyond required minimum distributions, but IRAs and Roth IRAs are beautiful strategies to pass wealth down to family members. Because those family members can continue to defer taxes on an inherited account. Because I inherited my dad's IRA, my minimum distributions are much smaller than my dad's, which were much larger. And so the life expectancy of that inherited IRA is much longer.
So, of course, the government wrote these rules, and so there are exceptions to that as well.
Sure.
And so you certainly have a scenario where beneficiaries were not made on an IRA account in testing, and then it becomes the birth date, the age of the oldest beneficiary. So if there's multiple siblings, it's then calculated off of the oldest sibling. If it is passed through a trust, and the trust was not a pass-through trust to identify the specific beneficiaries, same scenario, where you end up with the oldest beneficiary, which could be problematic. What if it ends up being the spouse and the kids? State of Ohio can certainly determine that. Well, now all of a sudden the kid's required minimum distribution is based off of mom's birthday, right? So now that's going to dry up a lot faster than if they could use their own. So beneficiary designations are absolutely critical in your IRA and your retirement accounts to avoid those types of problems.
Great, thanks Josh. The last bullet point here, required minimum distributions will be included as income or in your taxable income unless you donate that money to a qualified charity. And that is a strategy that some people will deploy on their retirement accounts. It's called a QCD. That's an acronym for a qualified charitable distribution, where again, money goes directly from your IRA to a charity, a 501c3. If that takes place, where it goes directly to that charity, you can avoid paying income taxes on that minimum distribution. And you can do that up to $100,000 per year. Question?
Can you take it as a deduction too?
No. The question is, can you take it as a deduction too? The answer is no. You can't do both. The IRS won't let you do that.